And here we arrive at the Port of Los Angeles in San Pedro at the Princess Cruise Terminal to begin our adventure. Immediately upon checking in, we were assigned a personal guide to take us to our suite. We entered the Emerald Princess amidships at the impressive promenade area, which is 3 decks high. It has shops and passenger services, also a casino and several restaurants and cocktail lounges. Our suite was at the stern on the highest occupied deck. It had a great view. Our suite was very comfortable and spacious. We had a 4-room suite, a living room, bedroom, shower and jacuzzi room, and a lavatory and toilet room. We also had a very nice large balcony that would have accommodated 6 or even 8 people. San Pedro is a very busy harbor and has a constant flow of all types of ships. I found this amusing. A tourist boat came by to have a look at me standing on the back of a larger tourist boat. And finally, tugs got into position to guide us out of the harbor. On our way out of the harbor, we passed the Battleship Iowa Museum. That was certainly an unexpected treat. We hadn't gone very far when we passed an offshore oil rig. Our first night at sea, we dined at Share, one of the upscale restaurants on board. We ended up eating there 4 times during our cruise. Our first port of call was Puerto Vallarta, Mexico. There was a small contingent of Mexican gunboats that docked there, and then not more than 400 yards across the harbor was also a U.S. Coast Guard cutter. On many occasions throughout our cruise, I would come to appreciate the outstanding view from our balcony. Leaving the ship and entering Mexico was very easy and didn't even require being checked by Mexican authorities. We found this to be true also in all the other countries that we visited. Our off-road vehicles were sturdy but rough riding. They did a good job, however, of ferrying us around through several towns and some backwoods locations. We stopped in a small town of San Jose del Valle. We visited a couple of shops here, including this leather shop, which was very high quality. We stopped at this grocery store and bought some ingredients for a snack that we had later. Our guide took us to a tortilla factory. It was quite small, but made tortillas for several restaurants and food stores in the area. And finally, we went off-road to get to our mountain hike location. Our hike was on a well-traveled path that had a wide variety of trees and shrubs. We were at the end of the dry season here. As a result, the plants were not very green or lush. We did see an unusual vine that eventually gets so large it kills the tree that it grows on. We did did see a few blooming plants, seed pods, and cactus. The guide showed us a termite nest. We were told that they don't eat the tree that the nest is on. After a little over a mile hike, we get back to our vehicles and on the road again. We bumped along on a dry riverbed or arroyo, eventually coming to a pleasant shaded area for a snack of tortillas and the items that we had purchased earlier. Our guide showed us the old method of grinding the corn to make tortillas. And then we were once again back on the bumpy riverbed for several miles. It was for several members of our tour visibly uncomfortable. Eventually we were riding back on city streets again and headed for lunch on the beach at La Cruza de Guadalcanal. We did a little more sightseeing by bus and then back to the ship for departure from Puerto Vallarta. I expected to see many iguana on this trip, but here in Puerto Vallarta, near our own ship's mooring cleat, was the only place that I spotted any. I stood on our balcony and watched the mooring lines cast off, and then it was on to our next port of call. Our next stop was Huatulco, Mexico. Huatulco is a small but nice port of about 50,000 people. The view from our balcony often gave me a great view of waterfowl. These are cormorants. had several nice beaches here that they seemed quite proud of. They also had some interesting geologic features here. Do you see the face in this cliff? Here, Linda is on her phone giving her sister Nancy a report on our adventures. There were several areas in Huatuco that had nice plants and flowers in bloom. Most of the churches throughout our trip were very colorfully decorated, and considering that most are very old, they were also well maintained. One of the stops on our bus tour gave us a great view of our ship. And then it was time to go back to the Emerald Princess and on to our next destination. That evening we ate at the Crown Grill, another of their premier restaurants. I had a lobster tail, one of several I would have on the trip, and Linda had a dessert sampler that I helped her eat. The next morning, we were at anchor in San Juan del Sur, Nicaragua. Interestingly enough, a Nicaraguan gunboat was anchored right next to us. Several of our ship's tenders, or small motor boats, were used to ferry us ashore. These boats also double as lifeboats and hold 75 to 100 people. We didn't stay in San Juan del Sur, but instead got on a bus and traveled almost 2 hours to Granada, Nicaragua. We arrived at the Convent de San Francisco to await transportation for the next part of our adventure. It was a large, old building that was very well maintained and contained many Catholic religious artifacts. Our vehicle in Granada was a horse-drawn carriage. We had a rather extensive tour another of Granada's points of interest, using, in this day and age, a rather unique form of transportation. I found several very interesting contrasts throughout Central America. Here's the local cable TV office with the most modern services available, and a block later, two men on a horse-drawn cart. Most of the buildings in Granada appear to be very old, especially the churches, but this one looks quite new by comparison. We saw quite a few statues in Granada. This is Ruben Dario, a Nicaraguan poet. And this is Francisco Cordoba, a Spanish explorer. Our carriage ride finally came to an end on Lake Nicaragua, where the next part of our tour would begin. We boarded a rather colorful small boat and headed out into Lake Nicaragua, the largest lake in Central America. The tour took us through a cluster of small islands close to the shore of the lake. Most of these islands were privately owned, and many had very nice houses on them. I spotted a green heron and got a pretty good picture of him. Several times we saw locals in the water fishing or trying to catch something, but we never found out exactly what it was they were trying to catch. Nicaragua has many volcanoes. Most are inactive. This particular volcano is Mount Mombacho. Here are some small bats resting on the bottom of a guy's boat up on its lift. We did see a fair amount of flora and fauna on this tour. This is a spider monkey, and they are indeed wild here. We saw several very nice houses on these islands. Fortunately, we also spotted a howler monkey. Some of the spider monkeys are very comfortable around people. This action even surprised our guide. I was surprised to find out that some of these small islands sold for as much as $1 million or more. And then our boat tour ended, and we headed back to shore and into town for some lunch. We stopped for lunch in the central part of Granada at La Gran Francia. It also included local dancers, musicians, and surprisingly, a pottery making demonstration. After lunch, we went to a beach that had a very good view of the two volcano islands on Lake Nicaragua, Concepcion and Madeiras. After a full day of sightseeing, we head back to the dock. And our tender is ready at the dock to ferry us back to the Emerald Princess. And we say farewell to San Juan del Sur, Nicaragua. That evening we ate at Shared Grill again. We really enjoyed the bread in this restaurant. And I had, as an appetizer, a small piece of crab leg with a raw quail egg, and of course lobster bisque. That evening we just happened to be seated at a table that engine vibration had an interesting effect on our silverware. The next morning we were docking in Punta Arenas, Costa Rica. That morning, large frigate birds were flying over the Gulf of Nicoya, and I managed to get a pretty good clip of one. After a short bus ride, we arrived at the train station. Before boarding the train, we were entertained by some local dancers. The girls' dresses were given to them when they were very young, and material added to the hem as they grew taller. This nicely restored train was built in the early 1950s. The train traveled on a track between residential backyards and a swamp. The train operated on this track only a few times a year. When it did run, the locals came out to see it go by. And children seem especially interested in the train. And here's a woman taking a video of the train going by with her cell phone. And then it's back on the bus to the next part of our tour. Some of the roads here were as good as you'd find in the United States, but every now and then we'd come across one that, well, just went nowhere. We stopped at this mini mall type place that had the usual tourist stuff, but also had this rather talented painter painting. Costa Rica has very attractive currency. This is a cashew seed pod before it is processed to get the nut out so that it can be edible. We arrived at our Jungle River cruise location and boarded our boats. Pretty soon we started seeing wildlife. This is a large group of white-faced capuchin monkeys. They were a very active bunch, and some even seemed curious about us. I got a good shot of a mangrove heron. This is a group of baby crocodiles, about 8 inches long. This is their mother, very close by, about 6 feet long. This guy wasn't real big, only about 4 foot long. I was very lucky to get this shot of a black mangrove hawk. We saw quite a few of these, a white egret. On such a short trip, surprisingly, we saw a lot of crocodiles. And then it was back to the dock to get on the bus again. It was a fairly long ride back to the ship. We stopped a couple of times along the way to look at interesting plants and pods that were alongside of the road. We arrived back at the ship much later than expected. I believe we had room service that evening. The next morning, we were dropping anchor near Fuerte Amador with many other ships waiting to go through the canal. I got this great shot of pelicans skimming across the water. And once again, we boarded the ship's tender to go ashore for our next adventure. I thought Panama City had a pretty impressive skyline. This unusual monument was to honor Adolfo Arias, a former president of Panama. This piece of equipment actually worked on the original canal construction. Our short bus ride took us to the train station in Panama City. Our train ride would take us all the way across the country of Panama, from the Pacific Ocean to the Atlantic Ocean, to Colón, Panama, following a land route that our ship would take through the canal the very next day. We saw lots of equipment used to build and maintain the canal. They served us a box lunch that was fine, but nothing to write home about. It did, however, come in a nice, perhaps collectible box. We saw several ships making their passage through the canal here on Lake Gatun. After a short bus ride, we arrive at the visitor center for the new Agua Clara locks on the Atlantic side of the canal. The visitor center offers a great view of the new locks and the truly huge ships that pass through it into the Atlantic Ocean. It's also possible to see at a distance the old Gatun locks. The old locks have 2 channels and ships can pass both ways at the same time, as you can see here. And then it was time to get back on a bus and travel all the way across Panama to Panama City and our ship. It's not as interesting as the train ride, of course, but did give us a good look at the country, both rural and urban, to include a toll booth on the nice 4-lane highway we traveled on. Panama City is quite modern, even by American standards. And I've never seen McDonald's fries this large, even in the U.S. We went by the statue of Spanish explorer Balboa. And once again, we arrive at the dock to hop on our tender and return to the Emerald Princess. And here we are once again back at the Crown Grill. I believe we ate here at least 3, maybe 4 times. And here's their lobster bisque. Crown Grill also serves specialty salts, and each had a unique flavor. That evening, they moved the ship into position so that they could start through the canal first thing in the morning. Going through the canal, we will be raised 85 feet at the Pacific Cocoli Locks. We'll travel over 50 miles on Lake Gatun, and then lowered 85 feet at the Agua Clara Locks into the Atlantic. Here we have just passed under the Bridge of the Americas and are about to enter the Cocoli Locks. This ship alongside ours is smaller and is going through the old Miraflores locks. We pull into the first lock with the tug helping to keep us on the straight and very narrow. And once in the lock, the huge lock gates close behind us. It takes about 15 to 20 minutes to raise us 30 feet and then send us into the second lock. Then once again, they close the lock gates behind us. And it is a pretty tight fit, even in this new, larger canal. We are just leaving the third and last lock of the Cocoli Locks and have been raised 85 feet into the entrance to Lake Gatun. From the starboard side of our ship, that's the right side, you can see ships going through and out of the old locks. After leaving the Cocoli Locks, we pass under the Centennial Bridge, which is the largest 4-lane concrete suspension bridge in the world at this time. Dredges are continuously at work in the canal in order to keep it open. This is the Gallard or Culebra Cut, where 100 million cubic yards of earth were removed. We also saw numerous maintenance sites and equipment docks along the way. The dense and lush Panamanian jungle was also quite impressive to see. Many times we passed other ships heading toward the locks that we just came through. This particular ship is carrying liquid propane gas. That's kind of unnerving. This ship had an interesting name, Rough Habit, and it was registered out of Majuro in the Marshall Islands. One of the perks with our suite was afternoon tea, and we had that the afternoon we went through the Panama Canal. It was very nice. An interesting point of information is this is the first time that this ship has gone through the Panama Canal, to include most of its crew and even the captain. As we got closer to the Atlantic locks, there was more and more traffic, and even some ships that were in anchor waiting their turn to go through the locks. Near the end of our journey through Lake Gatun, a boat drew up alongside to drop off the pilot that would guide us through the Agua Clara locks, which are located near Colón, Panama. Here we are approaching the first lock, while a large container ship occupies the second lock. This is the visitor center we visited the day before. We stood right here and took the photos used earlier in this video. An interesting feature of this particular set of lock gates is that when they are closed, they become part of the highway system. Another perk of our suite was 24/7 forward bridge camera view on the TV in our suite. As we exit the last of the Agua Clara locks, we get a last look at the Panama Canal. On our port side, that's the left side, we see a smaller ship leaving the old Gatun locks. Here is a good look at the Agua Clara locks that we just went through. And just on the other side of a small isthmus of land is the old Gatun locks. And now we head out into the Atlantic Ocean. The Atlantic Bridge is near completion and will be the third bridge over the Panama Canal. But the problem with this bridge is there are literally no roads built up to it at either end. Eventually, we go through the Colón breakwater into the open Atlantic and proceed to our next adventure. That evening, Linda and I opted for formal dining. It was fun to get really dressed up and go out. Going through the Panama Canal takes a whole 8-hour plus day, and the cost for our ship about $750,000. Later that evening, or the next day, we received these certificates of transit. The next morning, we entered the harbor at Cartagena, Colombia. Cartagena was a very busy harbor, and there were several container ships offloading containers. Cartagena, I thought, had a very impressive skyline. We boarded a comfortable bus and took a scenic tour through Cartagena. Cartagena is an attractive city with a great contrast of old and new. The city is almost completely encompassed by a fortification wall that is 300 or 400 years old. The center of the city is a huge fortification that covers over 1/2 square mile. It was built in the mid-1600s and is still in use today. It's called Castillo San Felipe de Barajas. We traveled all around the city, and I was impressed with how uncluttered and clean it was for a large city. And then finally, we arrive at our destination. We arrived at the Jewelry School of the Caribbean, and we were met there by our instructors. The school is operated by Carib Jewelry. They are one of the top emerald jewelry manufacturers and designers in the world. This was our instructor, Carmen, who was a very pleasant young lady. We each did 4 projects, and this is the instruction sheet for the 4th project, a ring. Here Linda is working on her ring. The other projects were a necklace, earrings, and a bracelet. When the class was over, we got to keep one of our projects. We kept Linda's ring and my bracelet. Carmen asked Linda to help her with her English. They showed us how they remelted their scrap silver for making jewelry, and then formed it into shapes, mostly wire, for future jewelry pieces in this piece of machinery. Carib also had an emerald museum. They had many great specimens of emeralds, including other colors besides green. They had yellow and a very rare red. This display had 1 million carats of emeralds. They also have the largest emerald cluster ever found in South America. Then it was back on the bus for another short tour of another part of the city. The Cartagenians were very friendly. More 300 or 400-year-old walls, they're everywhere. This was a monument erected to commemorate Cartagena's independence. The bus dropped us off at a combination wildlife center tourist shop. From there, it was a not-so-short walk back to the ship. When we got back on board and back in our suite, I was on the balcony and got this good shot of a pelican diving for a fish. It wasn't too much longer that we cast off and headed out of the harbor. Did I mention how friendly the Cartagenians were? Leaving the harbor was pretty scenic. There were more fortifications, and of course Cartagena's great skyline. As we head out into the Caribbean, we leave South and Central America behind and sail to Fort Lauderdale, USA. It was 2-day sailing to the US, and during that time we had a couple of more good meals, and I got to take a special tour of the ship. In all, I got to visit 11 areas of the ship that passengers and even some of the crew don't get to see. This was the anchor room. Notice the big chain links behind me. This was the engine and control room that controlled everything on the ship, right down to the temperature of the shower in our suite. This is the main central bridge area. There are also 2 auxiliary ring bridges that extend out over both sides of the ship. and either of the three areas can completely control the ship. The bridge had a large collection of nations' flags that they would fly when they were in that country. We did get to meet the captain, and he spent about 20 minutes chatting with us. We have to mention Dennis. Dennis was our cabin steward and was on call 24/7 and took excellent care of us. A couple of other interesting statistics. The ship carries over 1 million gallons of diesel fuel and over 50 tons of food. Fort Lauderdale is a small but busy port. On our day of arrival, there were several U.S. Navy warships in harbor, including the USS San Antonio, one of the new amphibious transports. And parked right next to us at the dock was a Coast Guard cutter. It was the third one we saw on this trip. As we leave the ship, I look back and they are busy restocking for the next group to go on their adventure. We were gone 15 days to 5 different countries in 2 different oceans and then through the Panama Canal and traveled over 5,000 miles. What an adventure.